And we begin now to look at the impact of all of this technology on the way we live, the way we govern, and the way we think. These new systems in our digital age are changing the way we run our cities. Greater access to data, supporting better decision making. How will that affect policy and politics? Well, they had to go all the way to Geneva to find somebody that could talk about this. So what's wrong with Missouri? But we have a gentleman, Michael Keane, who's going to talk to us, and his speech is entitled, "It's All About the Data, Technology and Finance in the Age of Mass Urbanization." Please welcome our speaker, Michael.
Thank you. A bit bright in here, isn't it? Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here with you in this fine city, which is my first visit to Kansas City. Not my first visit to the United States, obviously, but to Kansas City, and I'm very glad to be here. So before I get into this, let me just put this in a bit of context for you and give you a couple of seconds on how I got to be here, which is, I'm not going to describe my flight, but how I, generally speaking, got to this point where I've been asked to make this presentation. I started my career in sometime in the about the 15th century, it seems now, in the investment banking business. This is when you can hiss and boo. But I'm a recovering investment banker. I stopped doing it 12 years ago. I still have twitches occasionally, but generally speaking, I'm over it. And I stopped doing it because, and I'd done it for nearly 20 years. And in 1999, I decided to put my money where my mouth was and get into the entrepreneurial business and start a telecoms company, because I just done the private equity funding for what eventually became an extremely successful, in fact, the first ever genuinely virtual private network, genuinely global virtual private network business, which is now the core of Orange Business Services. And I decided to start a telecoms company, which was incredibly bad timing because, of course, the day that we funded it was the day the NASDAQ started to fall, and then we ran into the what everybody calls the dot-com crash, but I persist to this day in considering to be a telecoms crash in 2001. So it was not very good timing, but essentially what I was looking at was data. This was the business that we started was a data business. It was one of the first genuinely native IP as an internet protocol-based networking businesses. So what it was based upon was a view that the world was becoming connected, and this was a business which, the business that we'd taken public when in my days at Morgan Stanley, was a business which existed because it was able to get away from the bilateral telecommunications world that existed had existed for years and existed certainly into the 1990s. And so it was about connection. And so I've been looking at data and working with data and things that touch data, whether it's telecommunications or software, and then smart cities. Now, I know nobody knows what a smart city is supposed to be. I'm not sure I do, but I'm going to have a go at it today to talk to you about it. So we live in a data world, and the third industrial revolution, which is what everybody starts to talk about. We've heard a bit about it today: digital printing, 3D printing, etc. We're certainly moving into that. I feel quite sure about that, and I'm very positive about it. I'm very excited about what we're going to. You know, we're already in, to a certain extent, a smart world now, because, you know, do we know anybody who doesn't own a smartphone? Although I caused some hilarity on Saturday night when I got to New York, and I took a phone call when I was having dinner, and the person sitting next to me, because I have a cheap flip phone, which I use when I'm here because I'm a cheapskate. I don't want to buy an expensive iPhone for when I use it here. And she said to me, you can't have a flip phone. Nobody has flip phones anymore. And I said, well, I only have one here. I have an iPhone at home. So everybody has a smartphone. But what we don't have is smart buildings. We don't have smart cities. We don't have smart blocks. We don't have smart infrastructure. So, as we move from the world of human to human communications, which is a smart world where we're all connected, we all have our iPads, our iPhones, etc., think about what the iPad is. The iPad or the iPhone is a platform. Okay? It's a platform for software and applications. When I want to update the functionality of my iPhone, I don't go to the Apple Store, I download an app. So, as we move into the world of machine-to-machine communications and a fully connected built environment, which is what we've got to do if we want it to be efficient, the effect on our world is going to be many times, in my view, what we've seen in the last, pick a number, since 2000, since we started to get into the smarter, connected world that we're in now. And so, what we need to have is a situation where this technology is almost literally built into the furniture. In fact, it no doubt will be built into the furniture and built into the buildings. So, but that's the tech. Those are the sensors. Those are the routers and switches, which will have functionality built into them to allow them to be smart devices. But what are we doing all this for? We're doing this so we can collect data. Because data is information. Information means the possibility of control. And control means the ability to influence, improve, optimize, etc. And given that everything that we've done as a species has been driven, the reason why we're here today in this wonderful building is because we've mastered technology. Whether it was fire or tools or the spinning jenny or the steam engine, doesn't matter, the wheel, etc. We've always done more with less. That's what technological advancement is all about. So, we've heard today and many times, and I completely concur with this, that cities are the engines of economic growth. There's plenty of studies which have shown that if you take an isolated community and you isolate it, you give them some technology, over time they will lose the use of that technology if they are isolated. The flip side of it is if you put people in close proximity, they exchange ideas, they improve, they become more productive. That's why cities are the engines of production. It's why, as social animals, we tend to congregate in cities. And I've put up there that we're entering a new golden age. I know it doesn't sound very likely, given that we're apparently all heading for a fiscal cliff and a literal cliff. I know where I'd like to see some of our politicians heading off a cliff, but starting with my own Prime Minister and most of the rest of his cabinet, actually. But we're only going to get into this golden age if we can harness the technology, and that means harnessing the data. Because the year I was born, 1960, there were 3 billion of us on this planet. There are now 7 billion. By 2050, there will be 9 billion. But I don't think any of us can really seriously pretend that we feed, house, clothe, educate, entertain 7 billion of us less well than we did 3 billion of us, or 1 billion. We do it much better. And we do that because we've harnessed the technology. And that is going to mean, as we move ourselves into the factories of the future, which are the cities, we need to control the information that flows around those cities. Now this is, for those of you who have ever been to London, this is a map of the London Underground, or the Tube as we call it. And by the way, I know I've been announced as coming from Geneva, which is where I live, but I am actually English, as you can probably tell. This is justly famous as a design classic of how to communicate information extremely effectively. And it does it very well. For a big city like London, I can find my way around London very easily by looking at the Tube map. And what it does is, it connects the dots being the individual stations, the stations being points on the map, etc. And it's a visualization of that connectivity. So the reason I put this up there is because I think it's about joining the dots. It's about moving out of a siloed environment. After all, if you think back to when we were mostly an agricultural society, you didn't need to connect dots. You lived in a very certain world. You were born. You probably didn't go to school because there weren't schools. You worked extremely hard in the fields. You got some unpleasant disease, and you died by the age of 40, if you were lucky. And if you were living in the, during the various wars that convulsed Europe or other parts of the world, you might quite likely to be carried off into slavery. And if you were carried off into slavery by the Ottoman Empire, probably castrated into the bargain if you were a boy. So it was pretty miserable and unpleasant, but there were certain certainties. You didn't have to think about what happened in the future because it was all mapped out for you. Nothing you did would change anything. We're in a totally different world now because I can go from Notting Hill Gate to Bank on the tube. I don't have to ask anybody's permission to do it. I just purchase my Oyster card and I go there. And in addition to which, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, who I'm sure you've all seen, the man with the mad blonde hair, who got stuck on a zip wire during the Olympics. Some people think he did it deliberately. I'm not so sure, but anyhow. During the Olympics, we all have a thing called an Oyster card, which is how you pay for your ticket. You can't buy a ticket anymore. You have to put money onto this Oyster card. They collected huge amounts of very interesting data during the Olympics about how people moved around, whether people paid attention to the instructions not to travel at certain times because it was going to be congested, etc. How did Londoners respond to the types of information that were being provided to them? Because, of course, they could see that the Oyster card is in my name. Was I traveling at the busy times, or did I change my pattern of travel? So they started to collect data, and they will use that to help plan the upgrades to the tube, plan the type of information which needs to be provided. Now, having said that, that's all terribly exciting and terribly interesting. I'm now going to contradict myself by saying this is yesterday. Because this, as you will see, is an entirely flat, linear, 2D representation. And what we're going to get into in the future is something which is totally different. It's of an order of difficulty, orders of magnitude greater to anything that we've experienced to date. Because we're going to get into a position where everything is going to be connected. So if you've got 6 billion devices connected to the internet today, network devices, which are essentially all about human-to-human communication, we get into the world of machine-to-machine communications, there will be literally trillions of devices eventually connected. And this is going to both offer an opportunity but pose a significant challenge, which is how do I manage all that data and what do I do with it? But the good thing from a city point of view, as we look at this, is that who is going to be in the best possible position? In fact, who is the only entity which is going to be really positioned to collect all that data from the city? The answer is the city itself, the city government. So you have an opportunity here, for those of you who run cities and work for cities and so on, to act as the gatekeepers for this data. And instead of it being our friend from Google, who was here a moment ago, or Amazon or Microsoft or IBM or Apple, creating a sort of giant city-based app store, they can do that, but they should be getting that data from the city. And this is important. I'm going to come back to this point in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to show you a picture of Halley's Comet, or Hawley's Comet, actually, is one supposed to pronounce it. I always thought it was Halley, but then I was corrected by somebody who knew better. So why have I put up a picture of Hawley's Comet? Well, the answer is, there we are, there's the answer. Hawley was the astronomer royal. He was the man who discovered Hawley's Comet, and he did it by a combination of observation, but also checking the data and calculation. But he was also, as well as being an astronomer, He was a brilliant mathematician. In fact, that's why he was an astronomer. And he worked almost as a bit of a sort of private amusement. He took some work which had been done by an Englishman called John Graunt about 30 years before, so this is in 1693, about life and death. In life and death, we have things called parish records in the UK. In life and death, births and deaths have been very diligently recorded, and the causes of deaths for a long period of time. And so what he was able to do was to build on the work that had been done to try and determine why did people die, what did they die of, what were they more likely to die of, how long were they likely to live under what circumstance. And it was the basis of the creation of the modern life insurance industry. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we come to one of the things that we do with all this data. And what he took was data which was collected for a totally different purpose, a purpose which is essentially religious in import, because people wanted to know what was happening to their mortal souls, why they were dying, that they had died, that they'd been born, made sure they were baptized, etc. But what he was able to do was then take that and say, well, the city of Amsterdam, for example, which for years had been funding itself by selling annuities on the lives of its citizens. Here's the data. You've been doing it on the wrong basis. Actually, this has been very expensive for you because people live much longer than you think they're going to live. And when we spent most of the 18th century and then the first part of the 19th century fighting the French, from Louis XIV to Napoleon. And one of the reasons why we were able to beat him was because although we had less than half the French population, was because we were able in the UK, or in England, to fund ourselves much more effectively than the French could. And one of the reasons we could do this is because we used the statistical analysis to create what would today be seen as modern financial instruments. And out of this, also, out of this statistical analysis, came other parts of the insurance industry, and ultimately came what we think of today as our modern capital markets. And they came out of the capital markets because you had a thing called Lloyd's Coffee Shop, which is where the original Lloyd's insurance market came into being. And out of the Lloyd's insurance market came the stock market. And out of the stock market came all the other stock markets around the world. These were the first ones. So the point I'm making here is that we take data, and we put it to use. Because the huge challenge that we have is how do we pay for all of this building that we've got to do? So the numbers are very stark. $50 trillion on infrastructure alone, and there's probably the same amount again on buildings between now and 2030. This has got to be funded by debt, largely by debt, because all infrastructure is majority funded by debt because it lends itself to it. Governments are not going to be able to afford to pay for this, so the private sector has got to do it. We've heard a lot about public-private partnerships. So this is where the rubber really hits the road. It isn't just about upgrading, it's about building anew. Because we need 230 new cities the size of Paris between now and 2050. Not to mention all of the improvement to infrastructure which is taking place now. And the way that we're going to do this is by using this data that we're going to collect from the cities. We're going to collect from the economic activity and the physical activity in the cities. And we're going to allow ourselves to define much more effectively what that city is, what that building is, what that piece of infrastructure is. So if I give you an analogy, on the plane that I flew over on, an Airbus A340, the Rolls-Royce engines, if they were Rolls-Royce, but maybe they were GE, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, aren't bought by Virgin Atlantic as a single piece of kit and then stuck in the plane. They enter into a 25-year contract with Rolls-Royce, part of which includes the provision of the engine, but the majority of the money involved in that is over the 25 years, it's service and maintenance. Those engines are monitored by hundreds of sensors. They get paid on the basis of how efficiently that engine performs. Now why is that any different to a building? It isn't, is the answer, because the majority of the value of that building, all the cash flows associated with that building, will be over time. They're not in the building of that building. The house that I own in England was built in 1518. My annual electricity bill vastly exceeds, unfortunately, the cash value that was spent on building the house. It's one of the reasons why my electricity bill is so high, because the walls are about that thick. But it's been there, it's stood there for 500 years. The fact that it cost whatever it cost to build it is an irrelevancy. What matters now is what it costs to run it, what I get out of it as a utility value, what I pay on it, what maintenance value I get out of it. So again, to give you a specific concrete example of this, if this were let's assume this were your apartment, this room. If you had a building, a modern building, which had sensors built into it, ubiquitous sensors connected to a communications infrastructure, and some of those sensors would pick up movement, heat, things like that, you would have the basis of a security system, because if you have a security system, it's essentially a movement sensor and maybe a heat sensor. Now, if those sensors are already in the building, and they're connected to a communications layer on which there is a piece of platform software which is able to collect that data, then you as the building owner don't need to get somebody from ADT to come and fit a security system. What you actually can do is download an app which allows the use of that data to provide a security service. Now, what that has done is, it's done a lot of very important things. It provides an additional source of revenue for the building owner, so it changes the nature of the asset, number one. Number two, it actually reduces ADT's cost, because about 60% of ADT's costs are in paying heavy-set gentlemen in vans to drive around and fit security systems and then maintain them. So they are then able to sell to the general public and to businesses their services for much less but a much higher margin. You expand the market, because you always expand the market when you reduce prices, and you expand the type of product you can sell, because I can then sell a security service just for a long weekend, for example, or for a week at a time, because if all I have to do is download an app, I can do that. I'm not going to put in a $3,000 security system to turn it on 2 weeks a year. So this is what I mean about it starting to produce different economic and financial models, which can then allow for better financing, which will attract the type of private finance which has always been behind the creation of infrastructure. The railways in this country, the railways around the world were not built by government, they were built by private capital. That's what needs to be done. The telecommunications infrastructure of the world were not built by government, they were built by private capital. The cities that we need to build will not be built by public capital, because governments can't afford it, because we're all getting too old, and they're going to spend all the tax money they raise on looking after us and paying for our social security costs and our healthcare costs. So it's going to be absolutely critical for the city, and I've run out of time, so I'm going to shut up in a second. It'd be absolutely critical for the city to be on top of this. And I'm going to finish with a couple of points only. The first is that we need to join these dots. We need to think horizontally. We cannot simply think in silos. So it's not, a smart city is not about smart grid on its own. We've got to think about how all these things connect, because only by doing that will we take control of what the real cost base of our cities is. And if we're all going to be living in cities, we better be paying attention to how efficiently we run these cities. Because if we don't pay attention to how efficiently we run the cities, then we will not be able to finance them. And then we will run into a problem. We will start going backwards instead of forwards from a technological point of view. We won't be in a golden age, we'll be in an age of chaos. Where's this money going to come from? In an aging, wealthier world, and this is true across the world, it's not just true here in the United States or in Europe, there should be a natural balance between the need for that aging population, or that population which sees that it's going to live longer, their need for retirement products, investment products, and for that money to go into funding the infrastructure which is going to need to accommodate all of us as we don't die by the age of 40 or get taken off into slavery. So we should be able to, we need to find a way to move that money from the life insurance companies, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, into paying for our infrastructure. And finally, I'll just simply say again, it's about understanding, it's about knowing. And the more we view, the better we can collect the data, the better we understand how to manage it, the better we understand this enormous capital asset that we're all sitting in today, the built environment, the better we will be able to fund it, and the more likely it is we'll have a long and happy many generations ahead of us. Thank you.